So I wanted to make a video today about the situation in South America and in Brazil, and look at that through the lens of, what's really interesting about that, but also explore a little bit around how media bias gives us such a poor understanding of COVID in the world, because by focusing only on sensationalized elements of a story, we miss the centrally important facts that are in the middle of it that are much more interesting than in the case of Brazil, which is actually a bit of a, I would call it a bit of a political diatribe. So let's have a look at the kind of media landscape of Brazil. Now, the reason I'm writing this now is because there's just been an event, and I'll get to that in a second, which has been bombarding me. And then I've looked at Brazil again and looked at South America and said, you know what, this story is really minor compared with things we could be learning. So this is news. The news cycle from, let me just show you here on Google. What I'm doing here is filtering the news to a particular moment in time. So this is 1st to the 20th of May. Most of the reporting around here is about how bad Brazil is as a country and how out of hand it is. There's quite a lot of articles, if you keep scrolling down and looking at stuff, that are all about how bad Bolsonaro's approach to lockdown is, how terrible and horrific the situation is, etc. So that was on the up to the 24th of May, and it really did reach a fever pitch around about the 24th of May. Once we go past that, the stories suddenly change, and we'll come back to why the stories suddenly change, and we start talking about the fact that Bolsonaro decided, told his health ministry to stop distributing cumulative data. So you'd think that this was all about wiping all data. That's not true. This is about cumulative data, and yes, that is slightly suspicious, because by only releasing daily data and not cumulative data, it's possible to hide things back in time, maybe misreporting, etc. So, it's definitely suspect. It's definitely the action of somebody who's trying to cover something up, but it's not an immediate sign of that there's a huge cover-up. And then we see a little bit period later, he gets overruled. So that's a great story, because Bolsonaro comes unstuck. His own judicial system forces him to release the information. And then we come up to today's date. Why have we got a surge in interest in Brazil? Because Bolsonaro's got the bug. He's got COVID-19, and now we've got something to write about, because it's a gotcha moment, isn't it? This strong man who didn't believe in lockdown, who's pressured his governors to unwind the lockdown quickly in Brazil, irresponsibly as far as most journalists are concerned, has now got COVID-19. So there you go. That stuck it to him. And that's the, that's the basic story we see from Brazil. But what's interesting is that that's a pretty poor take on the Brazilian narrative. So why am I saying that? Well, there are a couple of reasons. It's really to do with the shape, but perhaps the first thing I should do is to show you a video exchange between Imperial College and the state epidemiologists in Brazil, who were doing, a lot of actual practical epidemiological work, being out in the field, looking at what the death rates really were, looking at what was actually going on, and doing serology studies, etc. And this exchange between them and Imperial College.
Let me comment on that too. So first of all, we need to define hit hard. So this is the first thing, because when we look at mortality adjusted for the size of the population and adjusted for the stage of the pandemics, Brazil is intermediate. Brazil is doing much better than Europe, and Brazil is doing much better than the US.
Pedro, you can't say that with the reproduction number in Europe being 0.6 and the reproduction number in Brazil being 1.5.
That's absolutely an opinion that you can have, but I think we need to look at the reproduction number more carefully. What I know is that from the data we do have on mortality adjusted for the size of the population and mortality adjusted for the stage of the pandemics, so number of days since the 10th death, Brazil is going better than these countries. Obviously, it can happen that in the future it will get worse.
And what we can see, that's a very interesting discussion, because you know, on the one hand, Imperial College is pushing this whole thing, oh, it's terrible out there because the R rate is much higher. And he's coming back and he's saying, look, you know, yes, the R rate is high, but just because the R rate is high doesn't mean that you get to say this is the worst pandemic or epidemic. I believe this, you know, we have to talk about deaths per million. So let's have a look at deaths per million for the world and for COVID-19. So this is the world. Let's on worldometers. Let's order it by deaths per million, and let's see where Brazil actually falls. So the UK is you know, reasonably near the top. 843 for Belgium. That's the highest it goes for a major country. San Marino is really small, so that's quite a bit of noise there. I don't think we should take too much notice. Here we are at 652, Spain 607, Italy 577, Sweden 538, France 458, USA 402. Now, we've gone through a lot of the major countries with major outbreaks, and I'll point out that we have not yet seen Brazil. The reason we haven't is that Brazil is number 15 in the world. It is, as he said, a kind of medium position. There's lots of stuff, if you like, between the sort of 250 and 350 range, and Brazil is in there. It's certainly not near the top. This, you know, and it's certainly done a lot better than a lot of countries that have had some pretty harsh lockdowns, like France, Italy, and Spain. So, what does that look like in terms of South America? Well, in South America, it's also not the most hit country in deaths per million. We can see here that Chile is just a fraction more than Peru, and then Brazil is a bit behind that, and Ecuador a bit behind that, and then there's a big drop to Bolivia. But what we do notice is that Brazil has got a massive population, 200 million people, and therefore it has 65,000 deaths, which sounds, you know, really high. But when we put that against, you know, the US, that's got double that number of deaths, then we start to see that, hang on a minute, things are not quite as out of control, not quite as out of hand as we're saying. So what I want to do now is I'm going to switch over to a PowerPoint presentation I put together. And that presentation is, you know, it's got a number of charts in it. All of that data is simply taken from Worldometer. It's daily deaths data. I have a video on my channel that you can use to find out all of these sort of techniques, how I get the data, how I process it. This is very simple stuff. I'm not even going to do much R rate stuff today. And by all means, don't trust me. Go check it out for yourself. Go and get the data. Go and kick the tires. I really think that is a good idea, that everyone should do that, at least on something around coronavirus. Such an impact on our lives. Why just trust everyone else to tell you the truth when you can go out and find those answers for yourselves? And let's get our annotations ready. So what have we got here? We've got the UK versus the US versus Brazil. What do we notice? Well, look, I mean, the UK's curve is really steep and really long, and that's really interesting. The US, much lower down, but Brazil, almost the other way on, very, very slow to rise, very, very slow. So very, very different. And, you know, that's what he was referring to, that actually deaths per million wise, you know, Brazil is much, much less than these other countries, because it's taken a lot longer for it to climb up. Now, more recently, on the decline of the US and the UK, etc., our deaths per million has dropped below that of Brazil. So the death rate is currently higher there, but it has taken an awful long time for it to climb there, which is really interesting. So what else do we know? Well, we know that the shape of this is very interesting. So just move myself a little bit so we can see that, you know, fascinatingly, the lockdown goes in, then there's a big increase in deaths, then the lockdown comes out, and it's, you know, it's very much not the right shape. It's flat after the lockdown ends. So, you know, what does that mean? Well, that's quite tricky. That's quite a tricky one to think about, because, you know, here, you know, it's almost like it's increasing at this rate. It then upticks all the way, then it sort of flattens somewhat around here, and then it stays flat. And that is the complete opposite of what we would expect. And I think we just have to be completely honest about the fact that that's not the shape we would expect, not at all. We should, if lockdown ends and it's the thing that's mediating this growth, then we should immediately go back into a long second wave. And actually, this only goes up to, a couple of weeks ago in terms of before what we can calculate with today's death data. And Brazil has remained flat for weeks now. And that's very frustrating because 1,000 people are dying a day. We'd really like this to die out. But its deaths per million is below Europe and North America. And the length of time it took to get there is below North America and Europe. And I think that is a big story. And the fact that it does not fit this lockdown narrative is a big story. The fact that its leader is a bit of a Trumpian, to some people an idiot, I don't think is an important narrative. We never really bothered with Bolsonaro before in our media, not that much. Why is that so interesting now? Whereas the coronavirus and whether lockdown works, that's immediately important to everybody. So this next chart is really complicated. I need to break it up, but this is showing us that the daily deaths per million for 4 different countries, the 4 major outbreaks in South America: Peru, Chile, Brazil, and Ecuador. And you can see that they've all got very, very different patterns. The only thing that I would point out is the smaller countries, Chile and Ecuador, have got very kind of sporadic patterns. But Peru and Brazil, who've got bigger populations, they're perhaps easier to think about. So why don't we just move on and clean that up and just look at Peru and Brazil, and then we come back to the other 2. Right, what do we notice here? Again, the same pattern with for Brazil. It's coming in here. Ooh. It's coming in here, sort of flat. It goes into a growth phase, reaches a peak, and then it levels off. And perhaps the only difference between that and Peru, which sort of mainly does the same thing all the way up, there's a bit where Peru kind of comes over here and it goes under there. But honestly, what happens, Peru goes up a little bit higher before it curves off. Now, Peru's still in lockdown, Brazil isn't. What's the difference? I would say almost nothing. And that's another really key contraindicator to our story, because what should be happening is very different. If lockdown has been unwound, Peru should be seeing improvements in its R rate. Brazil should be getting a lot worse. Brazil is flat, so is Peru. There doesn't seem to be much difference between them. And if you wanted to rank them against each other, Peru is doing slightly worse than Brazil is, despite being much tighter on its lockdown. So that's a bit of a problem. If we then look at the smaller countries, better clear that off, then this becomes slightly more complicated. Let's deal with the one that looks most positive, which is Ecuador. They go into a lockdown, so they get an increase, they go into a lockdown, it flattens off. Maybe that's a good sign. They come out, it goes big. Maybe this is a second wave. The problem with making that case is that this now curves off by itself and comes back down again, all by itself without a lockdown. And we know that the deaths per million in Ecuador is about 1/3 that in the UK. So this is not a question of sort of saying, they had such a huge outbreak, they reached saturation. I mean, you can say that, but that's completely contra the imperial model. You're talking about death rates that are 30, 40 times lower. And so this is not in line with the imperial model at all. If we look at Chile, we get a much more mixed picture. Honestly, we have a series of incremental lockdowns. It's not in and out. What's going on in Chile here is lots of regional lockdowns. They seem to not really have very much here, and they're locking down. It starts to go up, so they lock another region down, so it goes up again, so they lock another region down, so it goes up and then down. And I would say, look, this is completely inconclusive. There's lots of lockdown points. There's an outbreak. There's not clear evidence of anything being related to anything else, except that when things go up, they have done some lockdowns. But other than that, there's nothing to be taken from that. So what have we got out of South America? So far, what we've got is 2 countries that are large, that seem to match each other, that break the story around lockdown and disagree with each other because one where they both grow during lockdown. One comes out of lockdown and flattens off earlier than the other, and overall the one that's still in lockdown is worse off than the one that isn't. So that doesn't mean that you can there's something that Peru did wrong that Brazil did right. It is just, you know, we don't know what makes this outbreak. These outbreaks vary, but it's certainly not clear. There's no clear evidence that lockdown, in fact, quite the opposite. It looks like lockdown has got nothing to do with these pathways. And then we look at Ecuador, we can try and make a case, but we find that our second wave peaks really quickly and goes away by itself, which seems to suggest that given the really low death rate, or the quite low death rate of about 200 per million, third lower than ours, that kind of points away from the imperial models. It's 40 times less than the imperial model, very odd. And then Chile, which is very inconclusive. So we really don't get anything positive out of looking at South America for lockdown. So why is this story not being reported? I believe it's that simple reason. It doesn't fit the narrative that people want to tell. It's not exciting. There's lots of unknowns in it. It's very slow moving. And we don't know what's going to come next. And it might just show you, this probably shows us how, you know, that Europe and North America have a different dynamic for some reason, and that lockdowns probably don't have anything to do with the progress of the epidemic. So I just thought I'd show you a few charts. This is the R rate in the UK. So you can see this classic component we'll see everywhere else, where the R rate comes down before lockdown, and then it's pretty much flat from that point forward. Not suggesting that lockdown flattened it, I'm just pointing out that everything happened before lockdown. And then we see this pattern throughout the world. I'm not going to show every single chart, but for instance, here's New York City, and we can see exactly the same pattern. Here's Sweden, no lockdown, but the same pattern. China, the same pattern, things coming down before lockdown, despite the mythology of the Chinese lockdown. Europe, we can see the series of lockdowns that people put in. We can also see the R rate has come down long before lockdowns are instituted. The US, we've got a slightly stranger pattern. I think this increase is either to do with under-reporting of deaths or the length of time it takes for the pathogen to spread across the states, or probably a mixture of the two. So we're, you know, but again, we see this distinct downwards trend to the R rate before lockdown comes in place. And then we have South America in general, and we can see, you know, before all the lockdowns, things have come down. Peru and Chile, Peru and Ecuador are early. Mexico, Chile, and Brazil are a bit later. If we look at Brazil, the R rates clearly come down beforehand. I mean, it does keep going downwards, but it is beforehand. Mexico comes down before the lockdown. Peru, even though Peru is really early, there's still some indications of the decrease in R rate before. If we look at Ecuador, we get a very big decrease in R rate before the lockdown, and lots of funny things happening after the lockdown, or while the lockdown's in place. So there's a lot of different counterexamples. Anyway, I hope that video was helpful. What I hope to show was that South America really doesn't follow the lockdown narrative at all. Does not mean, and I will keep repeating, it does not mean that you can prove that lockdown didn't do anything, but it does show that the evidence is not pointing to lockdown being a central feature in controlling this pandemic and the results of each country's epidemics. And I also hope I showed that, you know, media narratives, it's interesting how the media focuses on several stories and then points away. For instance, it focuses on how deadly Brazil is, but the minute Brazil caps off, it points away and stops talking about it. And I think that is a really, really interesting thing, and probably quite dangerous, something we all need to consider, that it's strange how a country that should not have capped off, but was being reported and reported about how terrible things were, when it stopped getting worse, we stopped reporting, and we didn't tell that story. So I think that's a very interesting problem of media bias. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to do this for yourself, as I said, there's a video on my channel that'll help you to gather data for yourself and reproduce what's in this, so you don't have to trust me on anything. Kick the tires, by all means, I invite you. Thank you very much.